Thanks, Steve. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. I never would have thought to address a conference dealing with health issues and medical aspects and of the human body, but planetary health is important too. And it's great that you're looking at this in a holistic manner, which is of course appropriate, but something I had never thought to do. So I appreciate you as the organizer and the audience interest. I came to look at sea level rise as a recent aspect of climate change, but it's something that I studied back in college. I looked at how sea level moved up and down 300 or 400 feet with each ice age when I was a geology major. And then when I got into oceanography and would look for ancient shorelines hundreds of feet below to kind of validate that sea level did go up and down as the ice sheets changed size. I never thought that sea level would change in my lifetime. It's only started. We've had about 8 inches of sea level rise this century as a global average, and that varies from 4 inches to 46 inches because of land moving up and down, and I'll get into that more tomorrow when I do a full hour or hour and a half at 11 o'clock. But as an overview, what's great about sea level, and I hate to say it that way, but is that the simplicity and the clarity and the visual aspect. That climate may be confusing because we're talking about carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that trap heat and it's hard to visualize. Temperature, we're colder some places, warmer some places, droughts here, monsoon rains there. Those are kind of confusing concepts. But sea level we've always assumed was going to be a flat level, except for tides and waves and storms. And it turns out again that the ice ages prove that sea level changes dramatically, about 350 feet every 100,000 years. We didn't see that because we were at the end of a 20,000 year warming cycle when the ice melted and sea level rose, and we would have begun the 80,000 year cooling phase to the next ice age 80,000 years from now. Well, we don't have to worry about that problem anymore. We're not going to have an ice age 80,000 years from now. We've warmed the planet to the point where we're going to continue to melt the ice. And it's unstoppable. We can slow it, and we should try and do that. But we also need to wake up to a really bold new reality that after 5,000 years of being relatively stable, that sea level is going to keep getting higher. And that's a tremendous change to us. Because we built our shorelines and our buildings, our ports, airports, railroads, our entire civilization is based around the waterfront. Not entire, but most of our world revolves around where the shoreline is. We assumed it wouldn't change. And even when I was a geology major in 1970, we didn't think you could melt the polar ice cap this century. It's going to be gone. It was there for 30 million years. Sorry, 3 million years in the North Pole, 30 million for Antarctica. It's a revolutionary change. And so what I've done is take the science and put together a case to help people see it clearly. There's 4 facts. The planet is warmer, 0.85 Celsius or 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century. A warmer planet means the ice sheets will continue to melt. That's physics. As the ice melts, sea level will rise. And as sea level rises, the shoreline will move inland. And so I try and take some fairly complicated science and put into an argument that anybody can understand, even me. Thank you.
Helen?
Yeah, I come at this whole issue as a physician, and I wrote a book about I don't like to call it climate change. The Bush White House called it climate change because it's less scary than global warming. So I don't go along with the Bush White House, so I call it global warming. But I wrote about it in 1991, and I thought, everyone will read the book and they'll fix it. How stupid of me. But I come at it from a medical perspective, and as global warming occurs, we're going to see all sorts of epidemics that normally would be located around the equator. For instance, malaria in Seattle and in Melbourne, Australia, all sorts of arthropod-borne diseases, tremendous heat waves, which some people cannot withstand, particularly old people. And there are many other medical aspects to this, including destruction of species, destruction of forests. In the old days, the forests used to migrate very slowly north if they needed to, if it was getting hot, but now it gets so hot that the forests are dying. There's no chance for the natural situation to reassert itself. We're in very serious strife. And when I look ahead, it's possible that by the end of this century it may be 4 degrees centigrade hotter. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. What? 7, or even they're saying 6 degrees centigrade hotter. That is antithetical to life, because it's not just a level playing field. The temperatures go up and down like that. We can't survive at those temperatures. We can't, and most species cannot. So we're on the course to suicide, and I call it the global gas oven, because it is. And what we have to do is leave the fossil fuels in the ground, all of them now. How that occurs, I don't know. So I come at global warming from medical perspective, and then I also come at nuclear power from a medical perspective and all other issues. Being a doctor, I can't help it. Thank you.
Seth.
Good evening. So in my day job, I study energy. And energy is the biggest challenge that we face as a society over the next 50 years. And one of the big reasons for that, Helen just beautifully explained the connection between energy and climate. There are also connections between energy and water, as we heard from John, and plenty of other ways in which energy impacts us. The reason it's the biggest challenge we face over the next 50 years is that as a planet, we're using more energy every year than the year we used before, than what we used before. And that's been going on since essentially the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and it will continue for probably another century. So not only do we have to be concerned about where we're getting our energy from today, which is almost entirely from fossil fuels, but where are we going to get even more energy in the future without using even more fossil fuels? That's the big challenge that we all face. And so I go and give lots of talks about energy, and a big motivator for the type of work that we do, the research that we do, is indeed climate change. And I try and avoid global warming, because warming sounds cozy, and I avoid climate change, because actually I come from Chicago, and in February, climate change sounds like a pretty good thing too. The term I actually like is climate disruption.
Yeah.
This is a term that was coined by John Holdren, who is President Obama's chief science advisor, and it's a great term because disruption really captures the fact that it's not benign, it's not gradual. We're taking a system that was generally stable and we're throwing it all out of whack with our carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. So I give these talks on energy and climate all the time, and inevitably when you do this, you get questions from folks who don't believe that climate change is happening, or they don't believe that it's we humans who are causing it to happen, or they don't think it's a bad thing. There are all kinds of what I'll call misconceptions out there regarding climate disruption. And I heard enough of this enough times. In fact, I even heard myths that I didn't have an answer to. There are theories out there that cosmic rays cause the planet to warm up, all kinds of crazy stuff. And you know, even as a scientist, I didn't have answers on hand to some of these myths. So I teamed up with a colleague of mine. His name is Doug Sisterson. He is a climate scientist. I'm not a climate scientist. And together we wrote a book on addressing all of these various skeptic arguments about climate disruption and answering all of those myths with the science in layman's terms. So I have a 12-year-old. He can read the book and understand it. So I think everyone here can as well. So that's really what it's all about. And I just wanted to emphasize one thing, because I think Steve alluded to this. So our climate is changing, but it's not immediately obvious to you necessarily when you walk outside. And I think this is the origin of a lot of these myths that are out there from the skeptics. And it gets at the point of the difference between weather and climate. Those are not the same thing. If you go outside, we're in Orlando, it's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit outside right now, and sunny. That's the weather here today. That's not necessarily the climate. The climate is that weather averaged out over 30 years. That's a long time. So, for example, 2 winters ago in Chicago, we had a brutal winter. It was really cold, and we got a lot of snow. And there are all kinds of people saying, well, where's your climate change? Because it doesn't seem like the world's warming up to me. But that 1 cold winter, or even 2 cold winters, or 3 or 4, that's not a sign of the climate. It's averaged out over 30 years. And over 30 years, there's just no question that things are warming up. And it's not so much the warming up that's the problem, it's all the stuff that happens when you warm up the planet. And I think we'll get to that with a lot of the questions here.
So as I thought a lot about this, and I've spoken to different people, I've kind of thought that one of the real hardcore questions that people might not say out loud, but they say to themselves is, how does this affect me? You know, if you say, well, there's an island that's going to melt, people go, oh, that's very bad, they're going to have sea level rising. And you say, oh, in Australia, they're going to have more wildfires, and people go, oh, that's very bad. But a lot of people thinking, but how does it affect me? As long as I'm okay, and I can do what I'm doing, and so it'll be a little hotter. So the question is, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years, a lot of us have children. If you're saying that occasionally there won't be almonds in the store, a lot of us are okay. But if you're saying something much, much more serious, then that's different. So the real connection, the reason people don't smoke is because they know that 30 years later they can be a problem. The reason parents want their kids to study is because 15 years later they're going to have to get a job and they want them to get into college. But somehow there's not a connection being made about what's happening now and how it'll affect them in 10 years, 20, 30, and 40. So is it possible to make a connection and say, listen carefully, in 40 years from today, this is what's going to be different about your life? And it's possible to even do that less than 40 years, like 30, because it seems like that's what people want to know. How are they going to be affected in 10 years, in 20, and 30, and 40?
Well, I could maybe go first. The reason that people eventually stopped smoking, when I first entered medical school in '56, we knew then that smoking caused cancer. Some of my colleagues were smoking then because it was sort of sexy, but they stopped soon after. But it took us many, many years to convince people to stop smoking because the tobacco companies were very clever. Their propaganda was, well, it's doubtful. It's like the skeptics. Mm-hmm. We don't really know. And they'd go to the pubs, because most Australian men drink beer in the pubs, and say, we're not really sure about smoking. And it worked until finally the medical evidence was so acute that people stop. And now in Australia we have cigarette packs that don't have labels on. They've got pictures of people dying of lung cancer, pictures of lungs full of cancer, pictures of people who've had tracheostomies and holes in their neck, etc. People still buy them, those who are addicted, but it's really had a huge influence, and that's going to take place now in England. They're going to have those sort of plain packaging for cigarettes. So it was a process of education, and in medicine, if you have to educate your patient. If you tell a patient they've got leukemia or Hodgkin's disease, you have to explain what it really is, what the pathology is in lay language, and then what the treatments are and what the side effects are, so the patient is part of the solution. It's education. Similarly, with global warming, it has to be education, and we're way behind the 8 ball with this, way behind, partly because the oil companies, Exxon and Shell and coal companies, they've got a huge propaganda campaign going to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they've got various think tanks in Washington who come on television and propound, it's not really happening and the like, men in their suits and their ties, very official. Often the think tanks are staffed by the same people, so they sort of interdigitate and vary. So there's a huge propaganda campaign going, and that's why there's scepticism, although the science is absolutely there. Therefore, we've got to counter this, and they've got lots of money, and the people who really know, including the International Panel on Climate Change, don't have much money to educate people. Therefore, I would say that it's imperative that we teach people about this, as we've tried to teach people about the medical dangers of nuclear power and nuclear war. And in the 80s, we were successful. When I first came, I'm just going to go a little bit. When I first came here in 78, almost every American I spoke to said it's better to be dead than red. And I thought, you'd rather have a nuclear war? Yeah, we don't want to be communists. And I thought, these people are psychotic. They were. Split between reality and perception of reality. So I organised Physicians for Social Responsibility, 32,000 doctors, 23,000. And we started teaching people what happens if a bomb drops on their city. They get vaporised. They turn into missiles travelling at 100 miles an hour, sucked out of buildings and the like. I'll go into that tomorrow if you want to come in here. And gradually people started to say nuclear war is bad for our health. And even the annual morticians wanted me to come and talk to them about they didn't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself. And they passed a resolution against it. So in 5 years, by education and getting on the media, because the media is determining the fate of the earth. That's how you educate people. Mr. and Mrs. Joe Sixpack out there, you know, with their babies and everything. If they know, then the politicians respond. And 80% of people became opposed to nuclear war. And I met with Reagan, I'll tell you that tomorrow. And we brought about the end of the Cold War with Gorbachev and Reagan. So education is the key, and only if people are educated do the politicians respond. And as Marshall McLuhan said, the media is the message. And the media is absolutely bereft of morality at the moment. All they want to do is sell their, you know, hemorrhoid cream and the stuff that, and erections, what do they call it? Erectile dysfunction or something. What do they call it? You know, and then they say, but the side effects are, it's just ridiculous, and selling drugs to people, you know. I really resent that as a doctor, because people don't know what the side effects are. So, therefore, we've got to get on the media, and okay. I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay,
do you know?
Well, let's talk about the facts. And I appreciate, you know, your great career of decades on nuclear and from the medical aspects. And of course, you're right that there's a lot of disinformation, and there is a lot of corporate money that's twisting the politics, both Australia and the United States, and you're absolutely right on that. But let's get down to the misunderstandings of the science are really pretty profound. Most people, and I talk to very diverse audiences from communities and church groups to national security to ports to not only in the United States, Europe and Hong Kong, and the misunderstandings about something like global warming are really profound. Sea level is both a proof of climate change as the size of the ice sheets change volume and move the sea level up and down. But for example, most people think that the melting polar ice cap around the North Pole adds to sea level rise. I don't know how many of you believe that or not, but I would say that in the general audience I talk to, probably 80 or 90% of the people think that the disappearance of the polar ice cap is why sea level is rising. It's not. They're like ice cubes in a glass. Our understanding of basic physics is really very profound. We do have to do a lot of education, you're absolutely right. But it's not just the disinformation about whether we should be using tar sands or coal or nuclear or solar or wind and all the energy questions that Seth's quite expert in. The fact is, we've assumed this planet was much more stable than it really is. The 5,000 or 10,000 years of climate stability that we've had, not weather variability, but climate stability, is really unusual in the planet's history. It may be a coincidence that the rise of human civilization about 5,000 years ago happens to have coincided with sea level stabilizing and climate stabilizing to that degree that sea level was static. Or maybe it's why we were able to develop so well as a culture and civilization. But the fact is, most people don't believe that sea level could rise 212 feet when all the ice melts on the planet. And that it's now unstoppable that we're going to have at least tens of feet of sea level rise. We have a lot of basic education to do, you're absolutely right. And we need to stay on this subject because it does affect everything from malaria in Seattle to all the other things you very well articulated. And it does get to the energy issues that Seth, I'm sure, can enlighten us on. But we have a real challenge to get the facts about climate change, and despite what people want to get us to say for disinformation, just like they do with cigarettes and cancer when I was a kid. But this is going to change everything. It's going to change the drinking water and the food supply and the disease vectors. And as we go from 7 billion people on this planet to 10 billion, even if we can reduce our energy consumption by 50% per person, we're going to be back at the starting point because we're going to have 50% more people. And the average person is using more energy. We do have to get educated. You're absolutely right. And I think we need to move the discussion forward to this issue, whether you call it climate disruption, which I actually like very much, global warming or climate change, doesn't matter. The fact is, after 5,000 years of stability, or maybe 10,000, everything's changing. And I only use sea level because it gets people's attention because it means real estate's going to move. Sea level is different. That people think it's the same as storms, like a Hurricane Sandy. It's not. A storm hits a region, and within a day the water recedes and you can rebuild. Sea level won't recede for 1,000 years. It's permanent flooding. It affects all the coastlines. It gets much further inland, up tidal rivers. We have a lot of education to do to ourselves before we teach others. And we've really got to get this right, because to your question, Steve, the problem here is this is a slow change. It's like getting cancer from smoking cigarettes. You're right. Good metaphor. But here the problem is that we're not going to see catastrophic sea level rise, just to use that one effect, for 20 or 30 years at the earliest. I mean, a little bit. Miami's already putting in pumps to keep salt water off the streets during king tide days. In Miami Beach, they just put in $15 million of pumps. And other cities around the world are dealing with these nuisance flooding events every 28 days that you can predict with the high tide chart when we have an extreme or king tide. So those effects are already happening. But it's just the beginning. It is the tip of the iceberg. No pun intended.
Bad pun.
Good pun. Good pun. Thank you. It's the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg's melting. But the fact is, we're going to get 10 feet of sea level rise. Every coastal community in the world within the next century or two is going to have to deal with this. We all have to learn the facts. We have to learn how to communicate it. Seth's book looks great. This is a modern problem. We didn't think this problem was possible 50 years ago to this magnitude. We did not think we could have an ice-free Arctic in the 21st century. We will. It's been frozen for 3 million years. Anybody that says, oh, it's happened before. I said, well, you must have a long memory. This is different, and it's hard to put in perspective. It's a different time frame.
Yeah, to get to Steve's question about why aren't we more alarmed? The people on the street, why aren't they more alarmed? I think John hit the nail on the head. It's easy to alarm someone about nuclear war because we can all envision tomorrow a bomb dropping and everyone dying, right? But climate disruption is a gradual process. It's darn scary, but it's not going to be darn scary tomorrow. It's going to be over the course of decades that these problems are going to happen. And there's an old story about a boiling frog.
Yeah.
If you have a pot of boiling water and you throw a frog into it, it'll jump out of the boiling water. But if you put a frog into room temperature water and you slowly bring it up to boiling, it'll just sit in there and cook. Because the change is gradual, it doesn't notice it. And that's sort of us. We are the boiling frogs right now. It's all changing around us right now. I mean, these changes have begun, as John mentioned, with sea level rise and all kinds of other things, increased extreme weather all over the place. It's already happening, but it's gradual. And so we don't notice it. Human psychology is such that we're not very good at analyzing a long-term risk. It's why people smoke, in fact. All those people who smoke know very well that they're much more likely to have heart attacks and cancer and everything else, but they do it anyway because it's in 30 years that it's going to happen to them, or 40 years, and just as humans, we're really bad at assessing that type of risk. If it were going to happen tomorrow, they would stop smoking. And unfortunately, this is what we're faced with climate disruption, is that's the timescale in front of us, is sort of decades when it's going to become truly catastrophic. But we need to start doing something about it today. We can't wait, because changing our energy mix cannot be done overnight. It can't even be done in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. It takes a long time to change our energy mix. We need to start today.
Occasionally I see some stories that are quite shocking. I heard someone say that in 2048, the oceans would be overfished. I keep reading stories about the term ocean acidification. I read something that yesterday, that something like in 15 years, 60% of the coral reefs could be dead. And then I also heard someone say that in 2048, which is only 33 years from now, if you take the fish out of the ocean, they said something I didn't really understand, how the fish interact in a way that keeps the ocean alive, and the ocean produces oxygen, and all of a sudden I was thinking, well, what does that mean? Does that mean, so again, between all these different terms, between the dead zones in the ocean acidification, the overfishing, the dying coral reefs, the increase in temperature, the increase in storms, the animal extinction, overpopulation, I guess, how should we be thinking about this? In other words, what is the hierarchy of what really should be on our minds, and what, again, is the time frame? Are you saying that we should, in other words, there's a woman who says that in 10 years from now, an MIT scientist, says that in 10 years from now, half the children are going to be born with autism. Now, that's very shocking.
Born with what?
There's a woman from MIT who said that in 10 years, all children, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Half the children born would have autism, half the children. So I don't know if that's accurate, but that was a woman from MIT said that.
No.
So I'm saying, what is the hierarchy of what you see is the first things that we're going to be seeing that'll affect us in sort of the time frames to get out of distortion into what really seems like the way things could turn out?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't think there's a simple answer, but this is an ocean planet. We tend to forget it because we live on the land portion generally, but it's not just the 72% by surface area, it's 98% of the biosphere, because of the oceans are an average 2 miles deep, compared to the couple hundred feet of forest canopy on land, that the 98% of the ecosystem is in the ocean. And the phytoplankton, which does make about half our oxygen, is something, the microalgae we can't even see. It's got more biomass than the trees. It's out of sight, out of mind. And you mentioned ocean acidification, and that's great because it's a really important concept. And I don't know how many in the audience have heard of ocean acidification? I'd be curious. Well, a little more than half. It's the pH. I don't know if you remember from school, but pH goes from 1 to 14, from acid to alkaline, and fresh water is neutral in the middle at 7. The oceans are alkaline, and they've been very stable at 8.15. But they're now down 8.1. That's a 30% increase in acidity because it's a logarithmic scale. To keep it simple, though, that plants are dependent upon the alkalinity of the soils. Roses and things like that grow or don't grow because of the acidity. What's happening in the oceans is really profound. The ocean food chain is changing. Corals may not grow well. Shellfish are already having a problem in the Pacific Northwest. The oysters aren't aggregating. The calcium of the shell can't aggregate because of a simple chemistry issue. The oceans are going to change, and the whole food chain is changing in the oceans. That's really profound stuff. It comes from the same reason that we're warming, because carbon dioxide, which we're putting in the atmosphere, and used to be in a range of 180 to 280 parts per million, and is now at 400 parts per million and climbing straight up. Carbon dioxide has been going like this, and now it's up about here. And the problem is that carbon dioxide traps heat, greenhouse gas, but the other thing is it dissolves in the ocean, it turns into carbonic acid. That's what's making it. So the both causes of warming, destabilizing the normal temperature regime that we're used to, and then the acidification, both come from too much carbon dioxide, from fossil fuels, from liberating that.
That's right. In fact, many more things are coming from that too. Almost every problem you listed in your question is driven by our emission of our burning of fossil fuels, putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's what's causing ocean acidification. The backstory there is the reason the ocean is getting acidic is the carbon dioxide we put in the air. Some of it dissolves in the water, and carbon dioxide plus water makes carbonic acid. It's basic chemistry, so we're making it more acidic, which causes all of these problems, killing coral reefs and shellfish and everything else. But it's our burning of fossil fuels that is doing that. It's also what's increasing the global temperature, which is what's causing the extreme weather, the droughts, the extra wildfires, the flooding, the extreme precipitation events, the stronger hurricanes. All of these problems, almost everything you listed, is caused by one thing, our burning of fossil fuels and the emission of carbon dioxide.
And of course, if you haven't heard it, methane, there's about 30 greenhouse gases. The biggest one we put in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide intentionally by burning fossil fuels, as Helen said. But if you haven't heard about it, methane is an even bigger potential problem. Methane is hundreds of times more potent as a greenhouse gas, but there's much less of it. But it comes out, it deteriorates to CO2. It depends upon the time frame. It's either 86 times over 20 years or 32 times more potent over a century. But when methane comes out of the ground, it's hundreds of times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat. The problem is that we don't intentionally put methane in the air. It's basically natural gas. But as we drill with fracking, that's another problem with fracking, that escaped natural gas, if it's unburnt, goes in the atmosphere as methane. But when we put it in trucks and things like that, which is basically good because it's cleaner than other fuel sources of petroleum, but any leakage gets into the atmosphere. But the big potential for methane is something we have no control over. As the planet warms, methane comes out of the permafrost in the Arctic regions. It comes out of the seabed. There's something called methane clathrates or hydrates it's like a slush just beneath the ocean bottom. And as the planet warms, that destabilizes and transforms from slush to methane. And it's now bubbling out of the ocean. And we can't control it because it's a simple function of warming. And it's probably, I don't know about Seth thinks about it, but for me it's the scariest unknown because we can't quantify it, and the IPCC just says we can't quantify it, so that kind of leaves it out.
Well, they're starting to look at it now.
They look at it, but they can't quantify it, so it's not in any of the equations.
I don't agree that you can't get people to concentrate on this, because when I first started talking about nuclear war, everyone thought I was mad. And the media said, what are doctors talking about this for? This is a political issue. We said, no, it's actually a medical issue. And this is a medical issue too. So if you bring it down to people's lives and their children that they love, who are going to live another 50 or 60 or 70 years, who will inherit what we've done, then you can get them to concentrate and understand. These issues are complex but need to be boiled down in a simplified language that people can understand. I think methane's interesting because cows will, to use a word we don't usually use, fart methane. And there's a scientific organisation in Australia who worked out that if you collected the methane from 2 cows over a year, they could power a single house with everything it needs, because methane is used and can be used for electricity and the like. That's kind of funny, but everyone, or most people here, eat meat. So you've got millions of cows and chooks, you call them chickens.
Not in this audience.
All right, you don't. I'm generalising. The Americans like to eat meat. So we've got chooks, which you call chickens, pigs, cows, sheep, all producing methane. And the permafrost, of course, is really scary. I want to address a couple of other issues. Overpopulation. The way we can stop overpopulation, and we've known it for a long time, is to educate the women of the world and provide them with contraceptives. And then they stop having babies, or only have, 2. And so it's really time. And don't tell me we don't have the money. We've got a huge amount of money in the world, but it's all allocated to the really rich, who get richer and richer and are addicted to wealth, except when they die, they realise they've probably done the wrong thing. So the solutions are all here, but it's the priorities that are wrong. And I'd just say one other thing, that the Earth is like a human body. The ozone is like the skin that protects us from the ultraviolet light from the sun. In Australia, the ozone is really thin, and we've got a very high incidence of malignant melanoma, 1 in 9, and a very high incidence of skin cancer in Australia. The atmosphere is a temperature control mechanism which is located in the midbrain and brainstem, and if you get a tumour there, you can die from the temperature just going out of control. Then the lungs are the trees of the earth, because they inhale carbon dioxide and excrete oxygen, which we breathe. And therefore they're essential in what we're doing. I mean, I even look at toilet paper in my bathroom here. There are 2 rolls of toilet paper. Everyone uses it, you know, but how many trees are we chopping down to wipe our bottoms? In India, they don't use toilet paper, they use water and wash themselves, and it's really very clean. That's just one example, and I'm not saying you have to do that, but newspapers, I mean, paper napkins, you don't need paper napkins. I use my handkerchief. Don't blow your nose on trees, blow your nose on a handkerchief. Everything and paper towels in the kitchen, think about the fact that you're blowing your nose or using the lungs of the earth for these trivial pursuits. Then the water supplies, the oceans and the rivers, they're the blood supply, the circulation of the world. And then the rocks and etc. are the skeleton. And in a human body, if we've got a person in the intensive care unit, we might stabilise the electrolytes, the cardiac function, the liver function, and then one thing, like getting an infection or something else, will destabilise the whole system. And the systems intersect together, so the patient goes into cardiac failure, renal failure, etc., and then they die. And the planet is like that. It's so delicate, and we don't know a lot about it. We know some, but we can compare it to a human body.
Oh, okay, that's a great metaphor and very interesting. I may use parts of that, but let's think of this realistically. We've got 7 billion people. Even everybody stops using toilet paper and does all the other things you've suggested.
Oh, that's only a trivial thing.
I understand that, but let's be realistic here. That at 7 billion headed to 10, and with the average person using more energy, and that heating being the cause of the ocean acidification and the climate destabilization, we come down to, in spite of all the good efforts we should do with population education or birth control, and I agree with that, but we can also chart out that the graphs don't work, that over our lifetimes, over the next 20 years, even if we do all the things we should, this problem is unfortunately going to get worse. We need to do 2 things very seriously. We need to adapt to a changing climate and not fool ourselves into thinking we can stop the change, but then also try hard as hell to slow the warming. Those are 2 very different thoughts, and in fact, they seem like they're diametrically opposed, but they're not, and they're just reality. The fact is, even if we stop all fossil fuels today, 100%, if we could go 100% solar now and keep CO2 at 402 parts per million, where it is today, we're still going to have sea level rise. We're still going to have the disease changes. We're still going to have this change in agriculture, the droughts. The ocean currents already changed. You can't put this toothpaste back in the tube once it's been squeezed out. So we need to do 2 things. And keep it very clear, in spite of all the nice metaphors. The fact is, we have locked in a fair amount of climate destabilization. It's unfortunate. If we could go back and 30 or 40 years ago and have listened and maybe gotten off fossil fuels, we could have fixed this. It's like the patient who's now smoked 1,000 packs of cigarettes. You can't take that out of their lungs. Thank you. And the fact is that we've got to begin to adapt to a changing climate. The governments of the world are now agreed to try and keep global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, that's 3.6 Fahrenheit, to try and keep it to that. And they don't know how to do that. And very few scientists believe it's doable. 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees roughly Fahrenheit, is a huge global temperature increase. The difference between now and the last ice age is 9 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius as a global average change since the ice age. We are on path for catastrophically different climate, which will affect agriculture, disease vectors, everything. We've got to wake up to that. We've got to begin adapting, and we've also got to do everything we can to slow the warming.
Now that everybody's really scared.
Okay.
Go for it.
So, yes, we have 400 ppm CO2 in our atmosphere now.
parts per million.
Parts per million, that's ppm. The last time Earth had 400 ppm was about 3 million years ago. It's actually older than the entire record in the ice cores in Antarctica, which go back hundreds of thousands of years and show cycles never getting above really 300 ppm, and now we're at 400. And so you can actually look back and see what our climate was like when the atmosphere had 400 ppm carbon dioxide in it, and it wasn't anything like our planet is today. It was a very different place and not very hospitable to human society. That's true, but we're talking about timescales here. We're at 400 ppm today, but the planet doesn't change like that. It's going to take a long time for that heat to get distributed around and to change our climate to be like it had been a long time ago. So yes, no matter what we do, we have a major problem in front of us, but what we need to do is to buy ourselves time. And there are ways, conceivably, technologically, to, for example, get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, carbon sequestration concepts. Now, those technologies are a long way from being ready today. But they're decades off. But what we need to do is to buy ourselves that time. We need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels as fast as possible. I get worried when I hear a diatribe, if you will, like that, because it is really scary, but it's very easy to get scared into paralysis and just say it's hopeless. And if we say it's hopeless, then we're all screwed, right? We need to do something. And so, yes, we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to build seawalls around some of our cities to keep out the rising sea level, and we're going to have to move people away from coastlines and deal with the water shortages that are going to happen with the increased droughts and everything else. We're going to have to do all that no matter what, even if we changed our energy mix today, like John said. But that doesn't mean we don't start changing our energy mix, because if we don't, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse, a hell of a lot sooner.
Absolutely true. And when I talk to different audiences, and I don't give up hope, and I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and I live with it every day about what is the future and how to make this a positive message. And we all need to do that. You're absolutely right. Because it's easy to kind of just turn this into something, it's fatalistic and it's too late and so on. And that's not true. It's like going to your doctor and being told you have a serious illness like a cancer. The fact is, 50 years ago, cancer was a death sentence. Today, it's rarely a death sentence because we have technology. We've applied ourselves to it. We said we're going to tackle this problem. We can do the same thing with the part of climate change that's already locked in. We can build cities higher. We can evacuate other cities over the next decades. This is a problem that we have decades to adapt to. We can also do things like Seth said, and work to either reduce CO2 emissions in as we produce fuels, or even find ways to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it'll take decades.
Okay, so the trouble is that because of the American media and outreach and Madison Avenue, most people in the world have television now. And most people want to live like the Americans. You think Mozart wrote by candlelight. I'm not saying we go back to candlelight, but people did survive without electricity. I bought a camera the other day. I had to plug it in. Normally cameras didn't need electricity. The way we use electricity is really obscene. Americans waste 28% of the energy they use. They waste. Leave the lights on. It's quite extraordinary. And so people around the world are starting to emulate that. If Americans stopped wasting electricity, you wouldn't need nuclear power, because nuclear power provides 20% of the electricity you use. You waste 28%. If you hung your clothes outside to dry in the sun, there are lots of ways to stop wasting. So I think very seriously that if this country doesn't change, which has become the model for all other countries of the world because of your advertising outreach in Hollywood and the like, we're doomed. So it comes back really to what this country is going to do. And I disagree that we can't fix it. Here's Australia. We're bathed in sun. We're mostly desert. Got a hell of a lot of wind. If we put solar panels on every single building, on all the parking lots, and we had solar-powered cars, electric cars, that we plugged in and then plugged them in at night into the house, we would not need fossil fuel to have transportation, and everyone would become energy independent, and the GDP would go up, the unemployment would stop because so many people would be making solar. I mean, that's what you should be doing here. Your car companies, you call them autos, in Detroit, if you started making solar panels to cover the whole of America, all the buildings with solar panels, it would be fantastic. And we know that solar is becoming cheaper and cheaper by the day. You've got enough wind west of the Mississippi to supply 3 times the amount of electricity you currently use. 3 times. But you have to upgrade your grid. You need a smart grid. But it's so exciting. So you can serve, you can use, and Australia should become the energy superpower of the world and show the rest of the world how to live. The reason it's not happening is our blasted politicians are owned hook, line and sinker by the oil and the fossil fuel companies and the nuclear companies, you know, because it costs so much to get elected.
Okay, but listen, and by the way, Helen has been an icon. I grew up with my mom adoring some of the books and articles you wrote as a leader about nuclear power 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and really deserves a lot of credit. But let's be realistic here. You don't want us to use nuclear energy, okay,
No.
at all. You want us to go 100% solar and do all these other things. Let's just say we did that.
And wind and tidal.
Excuse me, Helen, just
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
I complimented you, okay? That assuming we did that, let's assume we did exactly what she prescribed, wrote by candlelight, you know, and did all
No,
of
I
it.
didn't prescribe that.
Okay, that we went 100% solar. Even if we did that, the planet is already 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. The ice will continue to melt. Seawalls will not keep water out of Miami. It's porous limestone, as are other coral-based islands. The water is just going to come up under the seawall. Okay, we have some harsh realities, okay?
Yeah, but we can slow it.
We can slow it, but let's not fool ourselves into thinking it's going to make the problem go away. Because the more we slow it, the better, you're right. And some people, just to throw a little controversy in here, would think that nuclear should still be on the table. Now, I'm not saying whether it should or not. I'm not saying whether it should or not. But you have to decide how aggressively we want to slow the warming. But also how we're going to deal with the effects that are already locked in, that are in the pipeline. And that's really what I'm asking us to consider. There is no easy answer here. You're right. And we must not make it depressing so we shut down. It's not. No, I really believe that. We have decades to deal with this, but we've got to do 2 things. We've got to adapt to the climate change, which is locked in, even if we went 100% solar today and kept it at 400 parts per million. That's 40% more CO2 than in the last 10 million years. And as Seth said, the last time we had 400 parts per million of CO2, the planet was about 2 degrees warmer and sea level was 75 feet higher. So we've got to disabuse ourselves of thinking that the answer is just solar, and I mean just solar.
I didn't say
No,
just
I didn't
solar.
say- I
said
didn't-
wind, tidal,
I didn't-
conservation.
Okay, if we did all of those things, we are still going to get big disruptions. We need to approach this realistically for our kids and grandkids and the generations beyond. This is not just about what we can see in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'll talk more about this in my lecture tomorrow, but there's really 3 things that we need to look at. Basically, we have 3 options. There's adaptation, which you're arguing we have to do no matter what, and I totally agree with that. We have to do some adaptation because we're stuck with the mistakes we've made already. There's mitigation, which is what Helen alluded to, which is changing our energy mix, and we absolutely have to do that. If we don't do that, we're all screwed. And then the third option that's, I guess, on the table is what's called geoengineering, which is using the Earth as a laboratory to either come up with ways to, on a global scale, reflect more sunlight away so that we don't warm up, or to take CO2 out of the atmosphere on a global scale. And there are all kinds of ideas out there on ways to do this, making micro bubbles in the ocean to make it more reflective so more sunlight will reflect off the ocean. Countless other examples, putting aerosols in the sky. And maybe some of those would even work, but I'll bet you they'll have a dozen unintended consequences that may end up being worse than the problem they were trying to solve in the first place. I don't want to use the Earth as a laboratory. I think that's a bad idea. So we've got adaptation and we've got mitigation. I'm throwing out geoengineering. Let's hope we don't have to do that. And so basically, you guys are arguing those 2 points, and one is not more important than the other. We have to do both of them.
I'd like to, so I'll use a medical analogy again. It's a patient who has cancer and has metastases.
Right.
But in fact, through chemotherapy and radiation therapy, we've stabilized, and the patient may live another 20 years. So we're in that situation that the Earth kind of has cancer. We have to accept the fact that it's bad and it will get worse, but we have to come in with the therapy now to stop it getting worse. It will get worse, we know that, but to mitigate.
I agree.
And I want to make one other very important point, that we see a lot of refugees now. You know, they're drowning in the Mediterranean and they're trying to get to Italy and all sorts of places. We ain't seen nothing yet. There are going to be millions of ecological refugees as the oceans rise. And in Australia, we've got a huge country, we're blocking them out. People are drowning at sea because we're cruel and we're violating the humanitarian United Nations Refugee Charter. How dare we do that? So you have to look also at psychology and human behaviour and how politicians think. And remember that most politicians are scientifically and medically illiterate. Therefore, we have to become literate, and it's easy enough to do if we want to. And remember your children. Remember your children. You've got a 15-year-old daughter. I'm glad I'm nearly 77 because I'll be dead soon. And we've had the best years of our lives. I don't want to face this. Yet I feel so desperate as a paediatrician for all the children of the earth, let alone the lions and tigers and kangaroos and wombats and emus. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about God's creation. I don't believe in God, but a lot of people do. But the Pope does, and the Pope's really starting to talk about it. So apart from his attitude towards women, he's pretty good on most things, this Pope.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on something Helen said about our children. You run into a lot of politicization in this conversation about climate, which is unfortunate because science is apolitical. It's just the facts.
Yeah.
But this is the way it's come about, at least most so in the United States, where basically if you're a blue voter, you support changing our energy mix and everything else, and if you're a red voter, you think it's all a conspiracy or that it's not happening or it's not a problem or whatever. But it's very hard to get those sets of people to agree on something, much of anything. But it doesn't really matter what party you vote for or what church you go to or synagogue or temple or mosque, or if you don't go at all, if you don't believe in God, whatever. There's something that we all agree on, or at least I hope we all agree on, which is that we want our children's lives to be better than our own, or at least as good as our own. And that is a future that is at risk.
So I would like to go back to something you said. You mentioned that as the temperature goes up and the Arctic melts, that we have this methane time bomb, so that not only is it getting warmer and climate change is increasing, but as it melts this Arctic, that this methane, which is more negative than carbon dioxide, is going to then pour out. So is this something that's far into the future? Is this, because it sounds like that would accelerate this and make it almost like you're saying there's a fire that's burning wet leaves very slowly and it's about to come to the very dry leaves. So is this methane time bomb a big concern, or how should we think about this?
It's a huge concern, and unfortunately, like the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet, which I want to talk about for a moment, both those things are the ticking time bombs that we can't quantify. We don't know how the Antarctic ice sheet is going to collapse, which is the biggest cause of sea level and changing the planet's weather and so on, more than the Arctic at the North Pole. This is the Antarctic at the South Pole. I'm talking about the big island with the ice on it. But methane are two things we can't quantify. And you ask about time scale. Antarctica is going to have significant melting this century and worse the next. Methane, in geologic time, we don't know. We've never warmed this fast. We're warming hundreds of times faster than the last 500 million years. We can't responsibly predict how methane will come out. Geologic time, 5,000 years is very quick, is the problem. When we looked at it, when we've had methane megafarts, and by the way, the scientists do use that term.
It's a good word.
Talked about, when there was a methane megafart some 50 million years ago, and a big bulge came out, that it was still over thousands of years. But in the scale of geologic time, looking at going back 30 million years ago when there was no ice on the planet, okay, things have a different relative perspective. Our problem is 100 years is forever, right? But it's not when we think about 4 generations being 100 years, and our kids and grandkids. It's not that far away, the end of the century. So to answer your question, Steve, we truly don't know how quickly and how much methane can come out of the ground, and that's really the big question mark in the climate change, because in all of the models, we know that it's the most catastrophic game changer, and we don't know whether it'll happen in 200 years or 2,000 years. Partly it depends on how warm we get, and that depends on how we make our energy, and it's a vicious cycle that one thing leads to another. So again, we have to do both things. We have to look at the risk to say adapt, and also use it as the motivation to say slow the warming as quickly as possible by going solar and doing all these other things, getting population under control. But we've got to be realistic about it. People say, don't you get depressed by it? And I say, well, I get depressed by getting older too. But there's no choice to that. And it's important to keep my sense of humor, as you all do, and I'm glad you laughed for a moment. But the fact is that some of this is locked in. It's going to be our biggest test, and I really do think, I find a way to say the glass half full is this: we've never faced a challenge like this before. If anything is going to bring out the best in us in terms of technologic solutions, different attitudes religiously about population and things like that, and adaptation, which humans are really good at adapting, I do think that climate change has the opportunity to be the greatest teacher of all.
Well, I have to slightly disagree with you, because the Pentagon is planning for global warming, and they've got lots of battle plans. For instance, who's going to run and take over the Arctic and all its treasures within? Well, Shell apparently is going to drill in the Arctic's melting, so great, let's get in and get more oil to make it melt faster. But don't trust the Pentagon. They've got lots and lots of plans, and it's great for the weapons builders. And I kid you not, they've been writing about this for many years.
I would actually turn that around. I would defend the Department of Defense in that they're actually some of the people at the forefront of recognizing that this is a major challenge that we face. It's their job to secure our nation.
3 weeks ago, I mean, and talking to the head of the Coast Guard and so on, and talking about this.
Coast Guard is in the Pentagon.
No, well, it's part of Homeland Security, and I was also at the Pentagon. I was at both of them, Helen, okay? You're right that there are military issues, and the military people, as Seth said, the strategic planners in national defense get this. And they are not looking at it as an opportunity to sell more weapons. I'm sorry, that is not the case, okay? Certain defense contractors might be.
Well, that's what I mean.
Okay, well, let's be honest here. The fact is that, to their credit, that the military, what they do, the quadrennial, every 4 years they have to do a whole defense review. And they have identified climate change as the biggest threat to national security this century. And it is black and white, and it is not something to be embraced or looked at as a positive opportunity for more weapons, okay? Quite the opposite. And there's an article in Rolling Stone in January, the Pentagon versus climate change, I think it was. And it was about the Congress trying to tie the hands of the Pentagon to not look at climate change. The strategists and the national defense people get it. I can tell you that.
Well, so do the people at the oil companies, the scientists at Exxon and Shell and all these
So
other companies, they know very well what's happening.
Why are they going ahead?
Well, because they have business interests that are pushing against it.
Right.
Money is the root of all evil. It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And the Pentagon is one of the biggest users of fossil fuel in the world.
It's the biggest, actually.
It's the biggest. So, bugger them, excuse my French. We say that in Australia. It's not a swear word in Australia.
But they're also some of the most aggressive about looking at alternative energy
Yeah, I
because
know,
they are
but
such a large
why-
consumer
yeah,
of
but,
energy.
you know, it's give cancer on the one hand and, you know, cure it on the other. And the weapons makers actually help to run the Pentagon. I've written books about this. You know that, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and the like. That's why they like to have wars, like in the Ukraine and the Middle East. Because after the Cold War ended, they had no market for their weapons. Anyway.
So there's a bunch of people that are going to watch this on replay, they're watching on live stream, and some of them are going to say, yeah, I think I listened to a lot of that panel, and I think what I heard is this isn't something that we have to worry about for a few decades. And they're going to walk away, and they're going to ignore everything else and say, oh yeah, I can wait a few decades. So again, for the people who are walking away saying, oh, it sounds like we got a big problem, but we got 20, 30, 40 years to deal with it. There's Lester Brown, who writes all these environmental books, says, we're going to have water issues, we're going to have food issues, the environment is exasperating every one of them, we are messing with people's water supply and their food supply, the storms are going to be greater, there's going to be more bugs that can live in areas they weren't supposed to. So again, for everyone who's feeling cozy, like, we're okay, we got to figure this out, but we got 30, 40 years, why do you want any of these people to care now? Why do they have to? They're figuring that Apple will figure out some solution, and why should people care now? How is this part of their lives in the next 10, 20, 30 years that?
It is happening. I mean, as I said, they just put in $15 million of pumps in Miami, the first phase of a $300 million plan to keep salt water off the streets every 28 days. Okay, they're not alone. I mean, people look at the Maldives and Tuvalu and Kiribati in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, but all over the world, coastal communities that are low-lying are flooding every 28 days when the tide is at peak height. Okay, that's happening now. People are getting concerned about their real estate values. But disease vectors are changing. The pine bark beetle has destroyed hundreds of millions of acres of lodgepole pine out in the Pacific Northwest and Colorado. The drought is probably a function of changing oceanic and atmospheric weather patterns. These things are associated with warming the planet. We are seeing the effects now, don't make no mistake. And I think to one of your earlier questions, Steve, the fact is that probably in the next decade, we are going to see more clarity about what's happening in Antarctica with the ice melting. And there's some glaciers down there that, back to the sea level, which is just one aspect of climate change, but it gets us our attention because sea level is something we've taken for granted as unchanging. And sea level affects the shoreline, which is different than storms, is why I use it. But we're probably going to have much greater clarity in the next decade about the rate of the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet. And that's going to have profound impacts for all coastal communities, and not just on the coast. Up tidal rivers. Hartford, Connecticut, and Sacramento, California, and Washington, D.C. are not on the coast, but they're on tidal rivers. They're as much a threat as a coastal city. So I think it's happening now. This is the story of the century.
Yeah, I think part of it depends who you are. We, like myself, who live in a city, we're often sort of isolated from a lot of the effects that are happening right now with climate disruption. If you're a farmer, you're pretty well aware that we've got a problem already. We are having more droughts, longer droughts, more severe droughts, and also more floods, extreme rain events. We're getting 100-year rains every 5 years or whatever it is. And both of those are bad for agriculture. The only way we see that is maybe on CNN, or our food prices might go up a little bit, which for those of us in the developed world doesn't matter so much. But this is we're insulated from it, but it's happening.
Yeah.
So once again, a medical analogy. I've caused quite a few people to stop smoking. They've been angry as hell with me. I've really frightened them, and they haven't forgiven me for 5 years, but they did stop smoking. Once again, it comes back to education, and I can't understand people who say, well, why should I bother? It's not going to be bad for 30 years. We're an amazing species with this huge cortex and the opposing thumb. Look what we've done to the planet. And how much do we value life? How much do we value our own life? How much do we value a rose or the lilac? Really, seriously, I had a man who came up to me after one of my talks and he said, I've got prostate cancer. He said, for the first time I've started smelling the roses because life is so precious. But really, we hold life on earth in the palms of our hands. And it's up to us, and we're very intelligent, whether we can save it or not. And isn't that the greatest challenge that we face? But also, it's quite wonderful because we can do it. Yes, there will be problems, but we actually, if we get on our bicycles and start going, we can actually do it. And that's how we think as doctors. We can save this patient. We'll stay up all night with them if necessary. We have to stay up all night fixing the mess that we've made for the planet, not just for our children and this species, but all other species and all the plants.
Yeah. To pick up on that real quickly, she hits on the right point that it's life on the planet that is a threat. The planet itself is going to be just fine.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing's going to happen to the planet, but we, plants and animals and other organisms that live on it, are the ones who are under threat.
Carl, many of us remember Carl Sagan, a really visionary astronomer who was very articulate and good at looking at the big picture. And he said the most exciting time to be alive was when we go from ignorance to understanding. And in astronomy or the universe or cosmology, that was in our era and his era. He died about 15 years ago, I think. And I think the same thing applies to humanity and our life and on the planet, as Helen and Seth just said. We didn't understand that there was a limit to population growth, that water resources and food resources and disease and all these things came together. We thought we could grow forever. And we're really now can quite clearly see that there's a limit to growth. And we can also see that as all cultures emulate Americans' consumption, as Helen aptly described, but as Seth brought up, the question of how do we produce enough energy for those people, particularly if we want to take nuclear off the table. That what does that mean for the medical aspects of what it does to us, whether it be heat issues, the acidification of the ocean. So in some ways, it's the most dire, scary time you could imagine, but I think you can also make the case for the opposite. That for the first time, environmentalism isn't some optional thing for the 10% who want to be tree huggers. This is where environmentalism hits mainstream. That if our water supplies change, and our food changes, and real estate goes underwater and some of our most valuable property, like the big California growing regions, are vulnerable to flooding, east of San Francisco, the San Fernando Valley. So this is the worst of times or the best of times. This may be the first time in 100 years that people have been concerned about environment where they said, you know what, this is an end game. We've really got to get this right. It's not a pretty picture, as you say, but the truth is, neither's getting older, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't make the most of it and take care of yourself, as I suspect all of you here are concerned about doing. Learning what we can, eating better, doing all those things for our bodies, but the truth is we've got to start applying that to the planet. And it means some tough choices about energy, about adapting to some things which are already locked in and in the pipeline. We should go solar and renewable energy in general. But this is either the worst of times or the best of times, and it's the teaching opportunity. I think you're both right. And we've really all got to look at that glass as half full. It's a really dire situation. Because if we let CO2 go to 900 parts per million, which is the latest projection at IPCC, and the planet go 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today, we're toast. So we've got to do two things. We've got to begin adaptation, make people realize what's at risk, and also work to mitigate, which I hate the term, slow the warming as quickly as possible, and realize that this is a different game, or different, I shouldn't say game, this is a different challenge than we've ever faced before. Let's use it to our opportunity as a teaching opportunity.
So we have 6 minutes left. There's a lot of people that are willing to listen to this kind of information about every year or two. And this is their one time they are tuning in to listen. So I guess as a closing comment from each of you, you know, people are going to see this, they're going to see this in the future, they're going to hear what you say, and a lot of people they listen to this, they're weighing it. Is there anything else you want to say to someone who's trying to decide whether they should care a lot about climate change and sea level rise and nuclear power and ocean acidification and deforestation and water shortages and overpopulation and species extinction, and they're kind of thinking, is this really a big deal or not a big deal? Is this something you want to say again, even if you've said it? You want to finalize your thoughts and say something?
We've done that.
I'll just say, I mean, if you don't care about this, what do you care about? This is as big a deal as it gets. This is life on Earth, right? That's what's at the stake here.
Yep, it's the biggest thing we've ever faced, ever.
It brings
If you
everything
love
together.
this planet, you'll get on and save it. And we can.
I think we've said it all. This
Yeah.
really becomes the test at a different level. And no matter what our perspective is about how to make energy, how to get off nuclear, how to worry about sea level rise, there's a bigger picture here. It's really, what are humans capable of? You know, we've proven what we can do technologically, but that's not going to stop the oceans from rising and the warmer temperatures from changing species and with ocean acidification changing the food chain in the ocean. We can wish all we want, and we can get great apps on our phones and come up with neat technologies to put things in space, but this is an ecosystem, and we really got to look at that technology. And the best, you know, I use the ocean's sea level rise because it's physical. People get that ice melts at 32 degrees or 0 Celsius. You can't change that. It's a way of bringing this down to something really simple.
Or the alternative question is, are we an evolutionary aberrant?
Meaning?
We're not meant to survive. Are we an evolutionary aberrant? It's a question we need to ask ourselves.
Now, when the newspapers or the pro-business newspapers say that this is not a big deal or whatever, what are they not understanding about how it's going to affect them? We're talking about how it affects us individually, but for a business who's pro-business, they want low taxes, they don't want government interference, what are they not understanding about how it's going to affect them that's making them think that we don't have to care about this?
That's a really big and complex question, but the zeroth order simple answer to it is that they answer to quarterly reports, right?
Yep.
They have to satisfy shareholders 4 times a year that they're making money. And this is a problem that is a longer time scale than 3 months. And if our, you know, I don't know how you even do that, I'm not an economist, but if we could restructure the way we even think about business to think about the longer time scale, because they will lose money in the long run, I guarantee you, that they're making decisions that they're going to lose them and everyone else money, but not in the next quarter, it's going to be years down the line.
I was going on the Fox Business Channel, and I embrace the most hostile audience because I think they're the people we need to change the opinions of, not the environmental liberal audience, if you will. So I welcome those opportunities. And in the green room, there was one of the most prominent climate deniers who gets paid by one of the big right-wing think tanks, if you will. He said, "John, don't you know what it's going to cost for us to get off of coal as a cheap energy source?" He said, "Do you know how expensive that's going to be?" I said, "Boy, you know, I guess I really never calculated that, Pat. Do you know what it's going to cost to move all of our coastal cities inland?" And he just stopped. He hadn't thought of that either. It's how we frame things. I mean, there are economic arguments, and we tend to think in quarterly reports and profits and so on. We're not thinking of this big picture. And that's exactly what we have to begin to do. We'll get more into this. Helen's got a session tomorrow. I've got one about sea level rise, and I hope you all embrace
it. As
it.
a doctor, I actually treat some of these people who worry about their quarterly reports on their deathbed or when their children are dying. And they fall into my arms and they tell me all the wicked things they've done. They know. They all know. They've got a moral conscience, and when they're at the coalface of life and death, out comes their truth and their morality with which they were born, that purity of soul. Everybody has that purity of soul. That's what we must reach when we talk to people.
Now, in case anyone's worried, don't worry, because tomorrow night on Sunday, We have Plan B 4.0, mobilizing to save civilization, the climate change, resource depletion, and environmental solution. So don't worry about anything you heard tonight. We're going to solve it all tomorrow night.